Almost Persuaded, Miss Mary King, written by P.O. Dixon, narrated by Pearl Hewitt. Chapter 1. In Want of a Husband. Mary King was sensible, or so she considered herself. Why, even she admitted she was plain to look at. She prided herself on her amiability as well as her generosity of spirit. What did outward appearance matter in the face of such estimable qualities? Being neither handsome nor rich, the only other things in her favour were her youth and vitality, both of which accounted for little in comparison to the popular Bennet girls of the local village of Longbourn. There were 5 of them in all. Anyone who cared to listen would remark on how their father, Mr. Thomas Bennet, decried them as some of the silliest girls in all of England. Though Mary found fault in his want of criticising his own family, she did not disagree with him, except when it came to his 2 eldest daughters, Miss Bennet and Miss Elizabeth. The former, renowned by many as the most beautiful of them all, the latter regarded as the brightest jewel of the country, they were indeed formidable competitors on the marriage mart, as the outcome of the Meryton Assembly the night before had attested. Mary's companion, Miss Anne Heston, sat across from her in the parlour. "I would not say the evening was a complete waste of time. After all, with so many Bennets from whom to choose, Mr. Bingley did single you out for the 3rd set." Mr. Charles Bingley, whose family hailed from the north, was the handsome gentleman who robbed Mary of her equanimity that particular morning. He had recently let Netherfield Park. He was also the happy recipient of nearly everyone's eager regard at the Meryton Assembly the evening prior. Not often did young men of 4,000 or 5,000 a year come into the neighbourhood. Thus his arrival was truly something, a considerable matter for all the single ladies wishing to find husbands, including Mary. Mary nodded. "True. But did you fail to discern how Mrs. Bennet glared at me the entire time? Was it not enough that Mr. Bingley danced twice with Miss Bennet? Mrs. Bennet behaved as though all of his dances ought to have been reserved for her daughters." "You must endeavour to regard her kindly, my dear. With 5 daughters out in society and nary a one of them with any prospects, is there any wonder she tries so hard to marry them off to every eligible gentleman who enters the country? Why, she would be remiss in her duties to do otherwise." "I dare not argue your point, but as my prospects are scarcely more favourable than the Bennet daughters, you will give me liberty to be less generous just this once." Miss Heston had been Mary's governess since the latter was a young girl of 8. She had been elevated in rank to Mary's companion when Mary had come out in society. Governess, companion, the title did not make a difference, for in truth she was more of a mother, at times an older sister, and always her dearest friend. Beholding Anne happily in love would be the answer to one of Mary's greatest prayers, save the blessed occasion when she would meet and fall in love with her own dashing gentleman. Mary's standards were rather exacting. The gentleman must be honest and decent, and he must respect her and treat her with kindness. A man who would treat her with the same regard as her own dear father surely would have treated her mother, had he been allowed the chance. Mary's mother, having abandoned her when she was too young to remember, left Mary with the lonely task of concocting her own memories. What fanciful memories they were! A young woman, free-spirited and strong-willed, who had made the ultimate sacrifice in leaving her family, putting her king and her country before everything. In essentials, a Joan of Arc. However, some years ago, Mary learned of her estranged mother's tragic death at the hands of her lover, putting an end to illusions of what had never been, and shedding light on the true reason for her defection. "I am determined my mother's mistakes shall never be my own. I shall be a devoted wife and mother." How does one help fretting over one's own dire prospects when Jane Bennet, whom everyone says is the greatest beauty in Hertfordshire, at almost 23, is nearly knocking on spinster's door? With everything in her favour, if she is unable to secure a husband, what are my chances? Mary recalled Lydia Bennet's carelessly spoken words when she skipped past her with a cup filled with bright red punch, spilling a good measure on Mary's finest slippers. Rather than apologize, Lydia had responded to her older sister Elizabeth's hushed admonishment with blatant disregard. Who cares 3 straws about her? Who could about such a nasty little freckled thing? The silly girl had no idea her voice resonated. She is vain and completely in awe of herself, and she has little regard for the feelings of others. Still, Mary could not help being wounded by the hurtful sentiments. She touched her face. Yes, I have freckles, as I always will, a family trait. They are nowhere near as bad as they have been. Miss Anne Heston, a genteel woman with a kind and generous disposition, arched her brow. I will give you leave to be less than charitable towards Mrs. Bennet, but I will not countenance your disparaging yourself, young lady. You are every bit as lovely as Miss Bennet, and every bit as charming as Miss Elizabeth. As for Miss Mary, your talents outshine hers. With regard to the 2 youngest, Miss Kitty and Miss Lydia, well, the least said, the better. Mary dared not argue Anne's point. The younger sisters were as different from the older sisters as night and day, not to mention their being out before the eldest were married. If my father were half as indifferent as Mr. Bennet, I might have been out years ago. Mr. Bernard King was fiercely protective, a fact Mary attributed to her being his only child and the only living reminder of her late mother, whom Mary was sure he loved deeply, in spite of his tacit admonishment against the mentioning of her name in his presence. Why else has he elected not to remarry? What other reason might explain the prominent display of her likeness in the library? Anne collected her sewing and began arranging her basket. I wager your chances of garnering Mr. Bingley's attentions are as good as anyone else's. You shall see. Mary shrugged. Perhaps you are correct. I shall take heart in knowing not all of the gentlemen in attendance at the assembly were enraptured by the Bennet sisters. Not that it bodes well for the rest of us, mind you. She leaned forward. Do you know what Mr. Bingley's haughty friend Mr. Darcy said about poor Miss Elizabeth? Pray do not keep me in suspense. He proclaimed her only tolerable. I venture she is not accustomed to such a wound. There is little chance of Mrs. Bennet pushing one of her daughters on him. Just when the town was beginning to settle down from the addition of the Netherfield party, news of the pending arrival of the regiment stole everyone's attention. What excitement for all the single young ladies who admired gentlemen in red coats. Even more exciting for Mary was the prospect of making the acquaintance of a particular officer that evening during a dinner party at the home of the Meryton attorney and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Phillips. Mrs. Phillips would be the one to host such a gathering, for she availed herself of every excuse to entertain guests in her home. She and Mrs. Bennet were sisters. Thus, Mary could not amuse herself that the Bennet daughters would not be in attendance. For the first time, Mary believed her plain muslin gowns of browns and greens no longer suited. Still, they were the finest she owned. Her father was frugal. He valued utility over finery. With Anne's help and a few well-placed ribbons, Mary prepared for the evening's dinner party with utmost care, paying attention to her hair and applying a bit more powder than usual to her face in an attempt to cover her freckles. Earlier during the week, she had espied a fine young officer on the street in Meryton. She later learned his name, Lieutenant George Wickham. He took no notice of her, but she hoped that would change starting that night. Espying him for the first time that evening as he strode into the room, his countenance confident and his demeanour commanding, Mary had never seen such a fine combination of charm and good looks as she attributed to the officer. She convinced herself there was little concern over his being in the younger Bennet sisters' company at the time. Surely they can mean nothing to a man of his consequence. He is too much of a gentleman to put them in their proper place. That must be the case, for any officer foolish enough to give serious consideration to young girls of 15 and 16, girls too young to be out, is hardly worth my regard. However, seeing him with Miss Elizabeth, who was closer to her in age, was quite disconcerting. Mary sought her governess's company, and the two of them sat in another part of the room, deliberating all they espied. Anne arched her brow. He hangs on her every word, and she is no less eager to encourage his every reply. What do you suppose they are discussing? Oh, what does it matter? I wager a man like Mr. Wickham renders even the dullest conversation enjoyable. How I envy Eliza Bennet. I suppose there is little likelihood of her willingly forfeiting her time with him before dinner. Do not be disheartened. Surely he will not speak with her all evening. If he sits with her much longer, his behaviour will give rise to rumours and speculation. Certainly Miss Elizabeth is too sensible to encourage such a prospect. I pray you are correct. With my having gone to such lengths in anticipation of making the dashing lieutenant's acquaintance, I should hate to think my efforts were for naught. When Mary managed to direct her eyes away from the gentleman, she discerned young Lydia Bennet, making a spectacle of herself at the card table. None of the other young ladies in the room exhibited such indecorous behaviour. I find it puzzling that no one in her family attempts to rein in her unguarded manners. What will it take to tame that wild child? Finally, supper put an end to cards, as well as Mr. Wickham's ardent attention to Miss Elizabeth. Miss Heston nodded. There, you see? The gentleman has leisure to enjoy some of the other young ladies' company. Smile, it may well be you. The gentleman cast a glance in her direction. Nervous heat spread through her body. Finally, this is my chance. She donned her warmest smile. Anne, I believe he is headed this way. I know it is your duty to remain by my side, but I would enjoy nothing more than time alone with him. He was but 3 feet away, when out of nowhere the 2 youngest Bennet daughters seized hold of his arms and coaxed him in the opposite direction. Mary's heart sank in her chest. Will I ever have my share of the handsome gentleman's attentions? Realizing her best chance of garnering Mr. Wickham's undivided attention was outside the presence of so many eager single young women, Mary recruited her reluctant father's aid in her quest. Papa, if you do not invite any of the eligible gentlemen to dine with us here at Kingston, then what chance do I have of making the acquaintances of any of them?
Mary, my child, I did as you requested in calling upon the admirable Mr. Bingley at Netherfield. What manner of benefit derived from my sacrifice? By my reckoning, you have yet to call on his sisters in return, as you said you would do.
Do not think I am unappreciative of your benevolence, but I am afraid your efforts were in vain. Having met the Bingley sisters at the assembly, I believe they are 2 of the last people I wish to know better, even if they are our neighbours. They are nothing at all like their brother. Where Mr. Bingley is amiable and obliging, and falls readily into conversation with the ease of a well-bred gentleman, his sisters are proud and disdainful.
Surely you exaggerate, my dear.
Indeed I do not. You need not rely upon my word. She turned to Anne. Did you not hear them laughing at the manner of dress of our friends and acquaintances? I heard one of them complain of what a torture it was even being there. Anne smiled, but said nothing. Rarely did she allow herself to be drawn into such discussions between father and daughter. Mr. King peered over his spectacles.
But what concern is any of that if the brother is agreeable? Is he not the true object of all the young lady's esteem?
True, but it will do little good, for his behaviour lends one to discern he is taken with Miss Jane Bennet.
Perhaps it is too soon to give up on the gentleman. I observed he had many dance partners at the assembly, including you.
While Mr. Bingley had many dance partners, Miss Bennet is the only one he asked for a second dance. Is there any better indication of his intentions?
Mr. King scratched his wispy speckled grey beard. No, I suppose they are as good as engaged.
Then you understand why it is imperative that you invite the officers to dine with us.
Do you intend to feed the entire regiment, or do you have a particular officer in mind?
Well, we must be sure to invite Colonel Forster and his lovely bride.
There is an idea. But how does inviting the two of them advance your cause?
I observed you and Mr. Wickham conversing at Mrs. Phillips's party. He seems exceedingly agreeable. Perhaps we might invite him as well.
He pursed his lips. Is there anyone else? Mary took a few seconds before responding.
With the three of us, Colonel Forster and his bride, and the lieutenant, I say we shall have a gay affair. What say you, Anne?
I say it is a good start.
The presence of the gentleman who occupied her thoughts day in and out at the table robbed Mary of her usual calm. Given the ease with which he readily fell into conversation with her father and the colonel, Mary could not help but be in awe. He had greeted her, as would have been expected, but no more than that. She could not fault him. Anyone who did not know otherwise would have supposed he was the happy groom in light of Mrs. Forster's comportment. It is all rather unseemly. At the appropriate time, Mr. King commanded his guests' attention. Colonel Forster, Mrs. Forster, may we be amongst the first to congratulate you on your recent marriage. Mr. King lifted his glass and addressed the dinner party. Everyone, please raise your glasses. Join me in wishing the happy couple decades of wedded bliss. Girlish giggles escaped the enthusiastic bride's mouth.
We are certain to, as I am so very young, and as the Colonel's wife, I am sure to have a steady stream of dashing officers to attend me wherever I go. Everyone is so kind, and the addition of Mr. Wickham to the regiment increases the prospects for gaiety immensely. Although I do not know for certain how it shall be when we decamp to Brighton in the spring, for I shall miss my new friends here in Meryton.
Clearing his throat, Colonel Forster interrupted his wife's ramblings. You are blessed to have made so many new acquaintances in a short span of time. You are certain to form new acquaintances in Brighton with equal alacrity.
I dare say my ease in forming new acquaintances pales in comparison to Mr. Wickham's, for he has been so fortunate as to garner the ardent esteem of the loveliest ladies in the country, particularly Miss Lydia Bennet's. She is exceedingly agreeable, is she not, sir?
Mary eyed her guest to ascertain the impact of Mrs. Forster's mentioning of the wild Bennet girl on his composure, and detected no symptom of regard. The gentleman tugged at his collar, as if silently begging to be excused from replying. Seated directly beside him, Mrs. Forster playfully placed her hand upon his and squeezed it. The coquettish gesture, in and of itself, exceeded the bounds of decorum, and surely explained the heightened shade of red which stained his handsome countenance. What an untenable position in which to find oneself! Being the ever-consummate gentleman that Mary surmised he must surely be, he extracted his hand from her clutches without giving offence. So gallant and decent. Is there any wonder he is a favourite of so many of the ladies in town? Mary had taken extraordinary measures to assure the evening's success, from the planning of the meal and the intricacies of the floral preparations to the seating arrangements. Alas, it was all in vain.
The dinner guests having left, and the evening at an earlier than expected end, she was no closer to garnering Mr. Wickham's attentions than she had been the day before. She blew a long breath.
In hindsight, I suppose inviting Mrs. Forster turned out to be a mistake.
Anne nodded.
She is young and lively, to say the least.
Yes, and she is comely and a determined flirt.
Even with her own husband sitting across from her, one could not have missed the way she carried on with Mr. Wickham.
It is a shame, too. I am persuaded it is a factor in the evening ending as early as it did. The Colonel did not appear too pleased with his wife, but what does he expect when she is so very young, and he is on the wrong side of 40?
Yes, there is a wide disparity in their ages.
Mary crumpled her brow.
What do you suppose is Mr. Wickham's age?
I dare say he is at least 30, but in such cases as his, I would say it is all in the packaging.
Oh, a package I fear I shall never have a chance to open. I might as well have been invisible for all he cared.
Anne reached for Mary's hand. She squeezed it tight.
You must not give up hope just yet. Clearly he has not a true preference for any particular young woman. That is to say, other than Miss Elizabeth Bennet. His having dined here at Kingston increases the chances he will request your hand for a set at the Netherfield ball. Let us see how he behaves. Then you will know if there is any reason for hope. Oh, yes, I must count on our next meeting. You are correct. With his having dined at my father's table, the gentleman will believe it is only fitting to ask for a set. I can hardly wait to stand opposite him on the dance floor. Although I have never seen him dance, if I am to go by his comportment and manner of walk, I believe he will be the finest dance partner at the ball. How can he be otherwise?
Chapter 2. Such happy manners. Some things were not meant to be, namely Mary's presence at the Netherfield ball. Her beloved grandfather had passed away, hence the Kings were in Liverpool. Mary and her grandfather had never been particularly close, owing to her father being his second son by birth, as well as in esteem. Still, he had bequeathed a sum of £10,000 to Mary, his only granddaughter, thereby bestowing upon her the lofty status of an heiress, a distinction which must certainly lend an air of significance to one who had long suffered such obscurity. People from all over, most of whom had good intentions, frequented the King's home upon their eventual return from Liverpool. They came to offer condolences, some under the guise of paying respects, others to lay eyes on Meryton's own young heiress. Mary and Miss Heston stood hidden in the shadows at the top of the stairs, and studied the steady stream of callers. Mary grew tired of standing in one attitude for so long, but the preponderance of redcoats drifting in and out of the house compelled her to remain steady to her purpose. Just when she had resolved that the only officer she wished to see would not call on her father, the gentleman came into view. Oh, how Mary's heartbeat raced when Mr. Wickham waltzed into the room. Until that moment, she had not realized how much she had depended upon seeing him once more. Surrounded by many of the other officers, Mr. Wickham was far beyond them all in person, countenance, air, and walk. She smoothed her gown.
How do I look?
Without waiting for a response, she drifted down the stairs, intent upon putting herself in his path under the guise of greeting the new callers. But her courage failed her at the last moment, and she ducked inside the library.
Oh, what am I thinking? He has never shown the slightest interest in me before. Why would I think this time would be any different?
Mary paced back and forth, and then walked to the window seat, to sit and to calm herself.
Mr. Wickham would never give consequence to me, not in 1,000 years.
She ignored the door when it opened, thinking it was her companion coming to find out why she had walked, nay, run away,
instead of seizing the chance to greet the dashing officer who had captured her imagination for as long as he had. Without turning, she spoke, her voice resigned. "Anne, you must think I am such a coward." The touch of a hand upon her shoulder caused a thundering quiver to race through her body. Startled, she turned and then jumped to her feet. "Mr. Wickham, I beg your pardon, sir." He was standing so close. The prudent thing to do would have been to step back, but retreat was not possible. He took her hand in his, bowed, and imparted a pleasant and perfectly gentlemanly kiss. This was not the first time a gentleman had bestowed such an honour, but this was the first time the courtesy left her weak in the knees.
Miss King, may I take this moment to offer you my sincerest condolences?"
Mary quickly composed herself. "Mr. Wickham, you are kind. The man of my dreams is standing here holding my hand, gazing into my eyes."
"Pray you do not mind my following you here. I have thought of you often of late, of how much you are no doubt suffering. I am no stranger to loss of this kind. I want you to know that you will find in me a generous listener should you wish to share your grief with someone other than your excellent father and your companion. I am at your service."
"Sir, again I thank you for your consideration. If you will, please accept my condolences as well. The loss of which you speak, is it a recent occurrence?"
"Sometimes I feel as though it was only yesterday, for I carry the sorrow with me. In truth, several years have passed. I speak of the loss of my excellent godfather, the late Mr. Darcy."
"I am sorry for your pain, sir. It must be a great comfort to you, then, that his son, Mr. Darcy, is nearby."
"Darcy returned to town while you were away. However, it is of no consequence to me, for I am afraid he and I can no longer boast of a strong attachment."
"I am sorry to hear that, sir."
"You need not be. My history with Darcy, as regrettable as it is just that, history. He and I suffered a parting of the ways many years ago. Truth be told, his father loved me better, and Darcy never did forget that. I do not like to speak ill of him, owing to my deep esteem for his father, but I believe I can trust you with the truth of my history with the gentleman. One of his father's, my godfather's, last wishes was that I should be given a living."
"Pardon my asking, but how did you find yourself in the militia?"
"I have been a disappointed man, and my spirits will not bear solitude. I must have employment and society. The prospect of constant congenial society was my chief inducement to enter the militia. I knew it to be a most respectable, agreeable corps. My friend Denny tempted me further by his account of their present quarters and the excellent acquaintances procured in Meryton. That being said, a military life is not what I was intended for, but circumstances have now made it necessary. The church ought to have been my profession. I was brought up for the church, and I should at this time have been in possession of a most valuable living, had it pleased the gentleman we were speaking of just now."
"Mr. Darcy?"
"Yes. The late Mr. Darcy bequeathed me the next presentation to the best living in his gift. He was excessively attached to me. I cannot do justice to his kindness. He meant to provide for me amply, and thought he had done it. Alas, when the living fell, it was given elsewhere."
Hushed voices just outside the door recalled Mary to the impropriety of standing so close to the gentleman, her hand still in his. He released her hand and stepped away. The doors opened, and Anne strode into the room. Miss King, your father has been asking for you. Thank you, Anne. I shall attend him immediately.
Mary dipped a deferential curtsy to the gentleman by her side.
Mr. Wickham, it has been a pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine, Miss King. I shall look forward to speaking with you soon.
Mary felt the colour spread all over her body.
He looks forward to seeing me again. I should like that very much.
May I call on you tomorrow?
Mary hesitated but a moment.
Certainly there will be a bevy of callers wishing to offer their condolences tomorrow as well.
She wanted, nay, needed, time alone with the gentleman.
Sir, if you are an early riser, you will find me down by the pond. I often venture there during my early morning strolls.
He reached for her hand. I shall count the minutes until we meet. He raised her hand to his lips, imparted a lingering kiss, and then slowly, reluctantly relinquished it. Anne wrapped her arm about Mary's shoulder and ushered her out of the room.
Mary, what on earth were you thinking? I know I was being forward, but what is the purpose in dallying? You know how long I have waited already.
Anne bestowed a disapproving grimace. Mary shrugged.
What can be the harm in a stroll by the pond? Surely you do not expect me to turn a blind eye to any untoward behaviour. I intend to accompany you. Oh, Anne, I suppose if you insist, then there is nothing I can do to stop you. But I really must insist you allow us a fair measure of privacy. Mr. Wickham is a charming man, and I believe he needs someone to talk to. Already he has taken me into his confidence. I am most anxious to discover where this leads.
The reason I came into the library was to waylay your father. He asked about your whereabouts. I believe he worries your interest in Mr. Wickham is inappropriate.
Why do you say such a thing?
He asked about the lieutenant's whereabouts as well. I stationed myself just outside the door to allow you a few moments with the gentleman. I know how much this means to you, but you must not expect me to ignore this sort of impropriety. Your father would be seriously displeased if I were negligent in my duties to you.
You need have no fears as regards Mr. Wickham.
Mary pressed her lips together and pondered what she might do or say to persuade Anne to her way of thinking.
My father has no reason to suspect his motives. Papa is overly protective.
A surge of sympathy fluttered in her stomach.
Mr. Wickham is a perfect gentleman whom I fear is merely misunderstood. The injustices against him are severe.
Mary told Anne all that Wickham had told her. It is a fantastic tale indeed to posit that a man of Mr. Darcy's standing would be motivated to go against the wishes of his late father for no more viable reason than jealousy.
You sound as if you have doubts.
Mary drew a deep breath and held it whilst she gathered her thoughts.
I am depending upon Anne to aid me in my quest to further my acquaintance with Mr. Wickham. Her good opinion of the gentleman must be as resolute as mine. Mr. Darcy did not make himself very agreeable. In fact, he was quite displeasing by all accounts, whereas no one has complained about Mr. Wickham. We must therefore give the gentleman all the credit of being righteous. He has no reason to lie about matters so easily disproved.
Anne's apparent scepticism and subsequent disapprobation vexed Mary, and thus she pretended to listen to her out of respect. But in reality, nothing Anne put forth hampered Mary's enthusiasm. Mary could never remember being so enthralled as she had been mere moments earlier. When she could, she drifted upstairs to the solitude of her room, with her head full of the dashing lieutenant. Mary darted out the door earlier than usual the following morning. She hoped she would find Mr. Wickham waiting for her by the pond.
"I see no harm. I am nearly 21. I am an easy distance from the house, close enough to avoid the impropriety of being alone with the gentleman, and just far enough away to escape my father's watchful eye, for he rarely happens along this particular path."
After walking for some time, she spotted a flash of red just ahead. Her heart raced.
"Mr. Wickham!"
She had told him she would be there, and he had shown enough consideration to be there as well. With a spring in her stride, she hastened her steps. He did likewise. "Miss King, I am delighted to see you this morning."
"I am equally delighted in seeing you too, sir. Is this not a perfect morning?"
"Indeed, the air is crisp and the sun is welcoming. I can think of no finer day for a walk." He glanced about. "Where is your companion, Miss Heston?"
"I have every reason to believe she will be along shortly."
"It seems Miss Heston's tardiness is my good fortune." The lieutenant clutched his hands behind his back and commenced walking by Mary's side. "I enjoyed our time together in the library. My only regret is that it ended much too quickly. Now we have a chance to continue where we left off."
"Indeed, sir. I have given the matter of your complaints against Mr. Darcy a great deal of thought. It is a shame you should not enjoy the living in Kimpton as your godfather had intended. I do not understand how the late Mr. Darcy's will was disregarded. It is a wonder you did not seek legal redress."
"There was such informality in the terms of the bequest as to give me no hope from the law. A man of honour would not have doubted the intention, but Darcy chose to doubt it, to treat it as a conditional recommendation, and to assert that I had forfeited all claims to it by extravagance and imprudence. The living became vacant 2 years ago, exactly as I was of an age to hold it. Yet it was given to another man. I cannot accuse myself of having really done anything to deserve losing it. I have a warm, unguarded temper. There may have been times when I may have spoken my opinion of him and to him too freely. I can recall nothing worse. But the fact is, we are very different sort of men. For that reason, he hates me."
"This is quite shocking. Do you not consider that the gentleman deserves to be publicly disgraced?"
"Sometime or other he will be, I suppose, but it shall not be by me. Till I can forget his father, I can never defy or expose him." Mary tilted her head. Anne had expressed reservations over Mr. Wickham's claims, while more than anything Mary wanted to believe him.
"Can you think of nothing more that might have spurred Mr. Darcy's disapprobation?"
"As I said, Darcy hates me. I can only contribute his disdain to jealousy. Had the late Mr. Darcy liked me less, his son's disapprobation may have been tempered, but his father's uncommon attachment to me irritated him. It is an affliction he has suffered since very early in life. His disposition rendered him incapable of bearing the sort of preference his father often gave me. As I am disinclined to dishonour my godfather's memory by calling attention to the faults of his son, I shall simply content myself to life as a lowly footman, for now. I do not think it shall always be so."
"Oh, do you intend to leave the militia?"
"I am finding my life to be less than it should be. I have begun to consider that a life in the law better suits me. To settle in a small town, much like Meryton, to practice law, to marry, and raise a family, satisfies all my notions of happiness." Mary pressed her hand to her chest. Her eyes widened. "By your expression, you are surprised to hear me speak this way." She sucked in a quick breath.
"I confess I have never really thought of you as a country lawyer, sir."
The fact that you have given any thought at all to me is a cause for hope. All this time in Meryton, I have admired you from afar, thinking someone like you would never acknowledge someone like me."
Mary was pleased by his admission, for she had taught herself to believe he was the one who would never give her any notice. Now hearing him speak otherwise rendered it next to impossible to suppress her enthusiasm. "Sir, I have noticed you, ever since the day I espied you and your friend Mr. Denny in Meryton. I believe you were making the acquaintance of the Bennet sisters."
"Ah, the Bennet sisters of Longbourn. I confess they are quite lovely, and I am always happy to be diverted by them. However, there are times when a man seeks something other than diversions and pleasantries from the fairer sex."
Mary raised her brow.
"Please do not mistake my meaning. The Bennets are agreeable to one's eyes, but save the two eldest daughters, they offer little in the way of serious conversations. I believe the youngest one, Miss Catherine, is the silliest creature in all of England, followed closely by the next youngest, Miss Lydia, who seems to take her lead from the former."
"If I may correct you, sir, Miss Lydia is the youngest. Miss Catherine is next to her."
"Forgive me if I have trouble sorting the two of them out, especially when walking along with you. How might I possibly be expected to give a care for the names of other women?"
"I believe the youngest is quite enamoured of you, sir."
"No more than she is fond of any of my cohorts, I assure you. The young lady is generally regarded as a harmless distraction. She likes the attention, and it costs me nothing to pay her little compliments and flatter her vanity from time to time. It is all in good fun, and I am persuaded she perfectly comprehends my intentions."
"And what have you to say of your other favourite, Miss Elizabeth Bennet? I confess to observing the two of you engaged in a rather lengthy intercourse during her aunt's dinner party. You were quite enthralled."
"I confess I held her in high esteem, but that was only when I first made her acquaintance. I have since been given cause to think differently of her. I find it difficult to reconcile how a woman in her situation would spurn the hand of the heir of her father's estate, and thereby subject her mother and sisters to such a perilous fate should Mr. Bennet meet with an early demise."
"Sir, I take it you are speaking of the Bennet's cousin, Mr. Collins. The refusal of a gentleman's hand is a rather sensitive matter. How can you be privy to such information?"
"Information of that nature is not difficult to discern, especially given a mother of Mrs. Bennet's temperament. It would not surprise me one bit if everyone in Meryton has heard the tale by now."
Mary dared not doubt the gentleman's assertion. To know Mrs. Bennet was to know precisely how she would suffer the loss of a potential son-in-law. Intrigued, Mary pressed on. "I should think Miss Elizabeth's stance would have pleased you and deepened your respect for her."
He shook his head. "On the contrary, it shows she is imprudent, dare I say foolish. A striking contrast to you, I might add."
"You flatter me, sir."
"You deserve to be flattered, Miss King."
The idea of his being there, bestowing his handsome smiles upon her, when he might have the privilege of spending time in company with any woman of his choosing, brought a smile to her face.
"Your smile is very becoming, Miss King, though I am certain you do not need me to tell you that. You cannot be at a loss for admirers."
He brushed his finger across the tiny specks on her cheek, unleashing a swarm of butterflies in her stomach. Long considered the bane of her existence, she now had cause to reconsider. "I shall never powder my freckles again." Mary and Mr. Wickham meandered a bit farther, the former being more and more flattered, and the latter being eager to accommodate. She was sorely disappointed when she espied Anne sitting on a bench just ahead, reading a book
as if it were not a chilly morning, and as though she had not a care in the world. As soon as Anne looked up, she closed her book and stood and walked towards them.
Miss King, I pray you do not mind my waiting for you. Your father asked about you, and I told him I would collect you from your morning walk, thus saving him the trouble.
Her posture rigid, Anne glowered at the lieutenant.
Good morning, Mr. Wickham.
He bowed. Anne forced a smile.
I do not suppose you will be returning to the house with us. It is early still, and the family is not yet receiving callers. You might come around at a respectable hour. I'm sure Miss King would welcome you, as would Mr. King.
I should be on my way. Wickham took Mary's hand and bowed before it. I shall call later this afternoon, Miss King. How disappointed she was when he released her hand without bestowing a kiss. The touch of his lips on her skin surely would have carried her through the long hours until their next meeting.
I shall look forward to seeing you, sir.
Wickham glanced at her companion and nodded. Miss Heston? As soon as he was gone, Mary folded her arms over her chest.
Could you have been any ruder to the gentleman, Anne? One would think you do not wish for him to court me.
Anne huffed.
Mary, I know you admire the gentleman, but courtship? What is the point in even entertaining such notions when you know your father has other plans for your future? If you are speaking of his sudden desire for an alliance with my cousin, you should not concern yourself. I am not at all reconciled to the possibility. I have admired Mr. Wickham from the instant I first laid eyes on him. I cannot say the same of my cousin. You have not seen your cousin in years. He may be every bit as handsome as your Mr. Wickham. In addition, he is very rich, and Mr. Wickham is not. No, Mr. Wickham is not rich, but that does not mean he is not suitable as a husband. I have spent all my life not being rich. I have no reason to believe it is of such great importance now. Mr. Wickham speaks of leaving the militia, of studying the law, of practising in a small town such as Meryton, of marrying and raising a family. Every word he utters rings chords of delight in my heart. His dreams are in perfect harmony with my dreams. What is more, he professed he has always noticed me. He was afraid I would never give consequence to someone like him.
She wrapped her hands about her shoulders and spun around.
Oh, Anne, can you not appreciate what this means? The gentleman and I are perfect for each other.
Nothing would puncture her enthusiasm, not even the pinched expression that graced her companion's countenance. Chapter 3. Almost Persuaded. Mary had enjoyed another perfectly agreeable morning with Mr. Wickham. As usual, she found herself pleading his case to Anne on the heels of his leave-taking. Mary paced the floor whilst Anne sat calmly on the faded sofa.
You are far too apt to find fault in Mr. Wickham, and for no other reason than he is exceedingly handsome. I contend handsome young men are every bit as honourable as the plain. No, it is more than that, as you well know. I had no objections to the gentleman prior to the unfortunate incident of your grandfather's passing, but there seems to be an indelicacy in his directing his attentions towards you so soon after the event. You are aware of his circumstances. He has not the time for all those etiquettes that others may observe. If I do not object to it, why should anyone else?
By all those etiquettes, do you mean conducting a proper courtship with your father's consent? Her mind quite decided on the veracity of Mr. Wickham's regard, Mary said nothing.
Mary, you must know what you are about. You must guard yourself against appearing foolish, or, heaven forbid, giving rise to gossip and innuendo that you are somehow deficit in either sense or feeling pursuant to your eager reception of his attentions. Are we all not fools even to contemplate falling in love, especially when there are no guarantees? In such case as this, I firmly believe in the notion that nothing ventured is nothing gained.
Whilst Mary might boast of Anne being her dearest friend, the same could not be said of Anne's reliance upon Mary in that respect. Anne was private. She kept her own counsel as regarded her own affairs. Once a week, she would spend time with her older sister, who was employed as a governess at a modest home in a village near Meryton. Having lost their parents in a fire, which also destroyed their home, the two sisters were the only family each other had. Mary had never once seen Anne show interest in a man. Thus, she assumed the horrible experience of a broken heart and shattered dreams must have made it so. All her attempts to persuade Anne to confide in her had been to no avail. She took a seat beside Anne and reached for her hand.
You must not allow hurtful experiences from your past to colour your perception of Mr. Wickham. You do not know him as I do. He is honourable, and he has been completely forthcoming with me.
Anne cradled Mary's proffered hand in hers.
The gentleman can say what he likes in explaining the haste of his defection from Miss Elizabeth Bennet and the speed of the transference of his affections to you. Any rational human would regard his motives as mercenary. Well, have it as you choose. Mr. Wickham shall be mercenary, and I shall be irrational. No, Mary, that is exactly what I do not choose. I shall not allow Mr. Wickham to take advantage of you. I shall do all in my power to prevent it.
Releasing Mary's hand, Anne gathered her sewing.
Enjoy his simpering and his smiles if you will, but that is all there will ever be of your relationship with the man.
Miss Heston stood to take her leave. Smoothing her skirt, she regarded Mary with an unyielding countenance.
I should hate to speak with your father, but I will not hesitate should matters warrant it. I would be derelict in my duties to him as well as to you to do otherwise.
Mere days later, Mary stood outside her father's study, her hand perched on the door as if paralysed with dread over the prospect of what he might say. Mr. Wickham and she had been no strangers to each other, intent upon a courtship of sorts as they endeavoured to sketch each other's character, often away from the guarded eyes of her father, and always under the watchful eyes of her companion. Her suitor was proving himself to be everything a gentleman ought to be, pleasant and amiable, even towards Miss Heston, who did not try to disguise her increasing ill-ease.
I cannot imagine Anne would have spoken to my father against my will, when I have abided by all her strong dictates and guarded my behaviour with Mr. Wickham.
Deciding it best to get the matter over with, Mary pushed the door open. Mr. King, his face grave, rose from his chair and gestured for her to have a seat.
Mary, my dear, I do not like the idea of your spending time in Mr. Wickham's company.
Papa, you and Mr. Wickham always got along famously. Why do you now object to his calling on me?
I now suspect his motives. Why the sudden interest? Even you will admit he never once took notice of you before you became an heiress.
Are you suspicious of the lieutenant, or does any gentleman who is not my cousin warrant your disapprobation?
I will not pretend that your uncle's designs for you to marry his son and heir do not meet with my approval. My brother's wealth is excellent. What type of father would I be not to wish to see you so well settled in life?
With all due respect, Papa, you have complained of my uncle's miserly propensities all my life. When have you ever agreed with him on anything? You two have never got along.
He reared his head.
I will not apologize for rallying behind my brother's cause. A father wants what is best for his child.
Uncle King never once considered me as a suitable bride for my cousin before grandfather bequeathed £10,000 to me. Am I wrong to suppose my uncle simply has no desire to see such a substantial amount escape the family coffers should I marry elsewhere?
It pains me to hear you speak this way. Your uncle's motives, as selfish as they may be, result to your benefit, do they not? You shall be rich. You shall have many fine carriages, a house in town. You and your cousin are ideally suited to each other. You will be very happy with him."
Long believing she and her father were of one mind as regarded arranged marriages, Mary drew a deep breath and diverted her eyes towards a picture of her mother. Her parents had suffered an arranged marriage. Her mother had abandoned everything to escape her sentence. Her home, her husband.
Me. I know you want what is best for me, but have we not always agreed that I should be allowed to marry where I will?
That was before. This is now. Your prospects are considerably improved owing to your grandfather's bequest.
Her father reached for her hand.
I only ask that you remain open to an alliance with your cousin John. Of course it is your decision. By the same token, I caution you to be wary of gentlemen, the likes of Mr. Wickham.
It bothers me that even my own uncle did not consider me as worthy of his son and heir before my inheritance, and now it is his favourite wish. If my own family's motives are mercenary, why does my father disdain Mr. Wickham solely on the basis that his motives are suspected of being of a similar bent? How is such hypocrisy to be endured? I will not think of that now. I so enjoy basking in the gentleman's admiration. I am a fair studier of people. I shall know if his motives are not pure. I simply need more time in his company, away from Papa's stern scrutiny.
Her father must have read her disquiet on her face.
Mary, you are entitled to marry where you will. But given a choice between your cousin and any other gentleman, I would choose the former. I urge you to do likewise. Family means everything.
A frisson of panic gripped her.
If Papa only knew I was half in love with Mr. Wickham already, I fear he would forbid me to see him. I must see him. I must find a way to continue to see him without raising Papa's ire.
Ever since her father's admonishment, Mary and Mr. Wickham's encounters were few and far between. Their fleeting moments together strengthened her resolve that he held her in esteem. Both Mr. King and Anne were out that evening. Mary was home alone. Sitting in the library, she closed her book and shut her eyes, thereby giving up her pretense of reading, so she might dwell on those things that confirmed her good opinion of the dashing Lieutenant Wickham. Of late, his discourse centred on marrying for love, and how fortuitous it was that a man of his standing might now have the means of accomplishing it. Never had he pretended otherwise. She was in a fair way of knowing this admission by heart.
I was reared to appreciate the finer things in life, educated alongside Darcy, and destined for a living that would have satisfied my every notion of happiness. I should be happy marrying for love with little regard for fortune, but gentlemen of my circumstances do not often enjoy the prospect of marrying where they will. I was robbed of such a prospect. I must marry a woman of fortune.
How it warmed her spirits and excited her hopes to suppose an alliance with her afforded him the means of satisfying his heart as well as his purse. The doorbell sounded, rousing her. The idea of its being Mr. Wickham fluttered her spirits. Surely he would never come around at such an hour as this. She sat and waited, and wondered. Were it to be the gentleman, then surely it would exceed the bounds of propriety to receive him with her father being away from the house, and no one there with her save the servants. Mary's curiosity was soon satisfied, her spirits gratified, and her reservations tossed aside, when a servant showed Mr. Wickham into the room. After bowing to Mary, he remained by the doorway, his back to her, as he uttered a few words to the footman, and then graciously closed the door in the servant's stead. In 2 strides he stood before her, and she rose to receive him.
Mr. Wickham, I had not expected to see you so soon after our meeting this morning.
He accepted her hand and imparted a moist kiss on her palm. Pray you do not regard my calling on you at this hour as rash. I wanted to see you, nay, needed to see you. Her knees nearly buckled.
Sir, did you forget my father is out this evening? Surely he recalls my having told him Papa frequents the pub every Tuesday night.
Again, I will request your leniency. I am aware your father is away, and that he will be gone for several hours. I so enjoy our time together, but I do not suppose myself to be your father's favourite.
Has he spoken to you in that regard?
Let us say he has made his plans for your future clear to me, that as soon as the mourning period is ended, he should like nothing more than to announce your betrothal to your cousin in Liverpool.
Mary dropped her eyes. How could my papa do such a thing?
Not knowing where to look, she walked to the bookshelves.
Sir, I am sorry Papa has given you the impression I am to be married to another. It is not true. It is nothing more than his own ardent wish as well as my uncle's. I have no idea how my cousin feels about all this.
Mary's heart slammed against her chest from the touch of his hand along her waist. He was standing directly behind her.
When had that happened?
She turned to face him.
Sir?
He leaned closer and murmured in her ear, "My dearest Miss King, you do not know how much it means to hear you say that. I should hate to think I stood no chance at all of claiming your heart as my own." His warm breath caressed her neck. Mary swallowed hard. His hand on her waist rendered her intoxicated. She trembled inside when he placed his other hand on her chin, traced his thumb across her lower lip, and gazed into her eyes. "Have I a chance? Do I dare hope your feelings for me are a semblance of my feelings for you?"
"Yes,"
she silently screamed. She thought better of speaking the sentiments aloud.
"Whilst my affection for him is equal to his regard for me, I dare not confess it, not in the absence of a proper declaration of his intentions. Mr. Wickham?"
Braced against the bookshelves, her body clamoured for something she knew not what. He pressed his lips against hers, gentle at first, and then urgently, coaxing her lips apart. The swirl of his tongue against hers convinced her there was nothing she would not do for the dashing officer who held her so intimately. His ardent kisses and pleasing caresses served as confirmation of his devotion. Such happy prospects for their future marital felicity pirouetted in her mind. She moaned. The effect upon him was immediate. He unleashed himself. A shivering moan escaped her once again.
"What is happening? Mr. Wickham is an officer. What is more, he is a gentleman. Surely his intentions are honourable."
Assured they were as good as betrothed, she ignored her mind's cautioning whispers and obeyed her body's fiery demands to surrender to the passions her lover's roaming hands induced. Elevated in his strong embrace, the hem of her black bombazine gown now mysteriously gathered about her waist, she allowed him to coax her body closer to his. The touch of his long, possessive fingers commencing an exploration of her most intimate parts flooded her core with waves of satisfaction, satiating a hunger she never knew existed. Before she even knew what he was about, what she was about, his hardness was pressed against her moist softness, poised to sweep her beyond the threshold of innocence. The faint rattle of the door handle pierced her bliss. Startled, she pulled away, ever so slightly, just enough.
"Did you hear a noise?"
He lowered her to the floor without surrendering her from his arms. His breath was warm against her neckline, his voice thick with passion.
Pay no attention. The house is empty save the two of us and the servants. I secured the lock. No one will interrupt us.
He trailed open-mouthed kisses along the soft skin of her neckline. Her heart fluttered as he lowered her bodice, exposing her. He brushed his lips against her throbbing tips and commenced to adore her. His ardent caresses and the pretty words whispered in between once again commandeered her sensibilities. Another sound compelled her to ease away, allowing enough space to cross her arms over herself.
"There it is again, Mr. Wickham. Perhaps—"
He placed his finger over her lips.
Trust me, there is no one there. Whoever it was has gone away. You want this. I want this. Let me do this. For us.
His soft, tantalizing whispers unleashed piercing tremors throughout her body.
We mustn't stop. I will be quick about this. Trust me.
Oh, how she trusted him, trusted what was to come.
Is this not the fantasy of every woman who has ever been in love?
She fought the urge to berate herself for the unladylike thoughts she always suffered in his presence of late. Never had she known such pleasures as those he currently bestowed, his kisses so ardent and his touch so searing.
I shall cherish the memory of this moment for all time.
Just when he had reclaimed her in his eager embrace, her moistness inviting his ardour, his hardness pressing forth to mark her as his, sobriety awakened her. Awareness of her situation overcame her.
I cannot allow this. Not now, not like this. We shall be married soon enough.
She eased herself away. She clenched her upper thighs.
Sir, we must not—
The doors crashed open, and light from the hallway flooded the room, rendering further protests futile as Wickham jerked himself away. In stormed her father, his eyes fiery with rage, brandishing a large club. Chapter 4. Akin to regret. Her ardour sufficiently doused, Mary made haste in correcting her attire so she would not appear quite the spectacle to her father. Wickham did likewise. That she was almost persuaded to surrender her maidenhood outside the sanctity of marriage could be of little doubt. Sensibility now fervently in control of desire, she congratulated herself. Her innocence was not lost. His back facing them, Wickham continued writing himself. The fierce pounding of her heartbeat notwithstanding, Mary approached her father with hopes of restraining his fury.
Papa, I beg your forgiveness. This is not what it seems. Mr. Wickham and I are engaged.
He curled his lips.
Silence, Mary! I will hear nothing from you.
But, Papa—
As soon as Mr. Wickham turned, Mr. King swung his weapon for what would have been a lethal blow had Wickham not cowered. Mary grabbed hold of her father's arm before he could swing again. Anne rushed into the room. Her expression horrified, her demeanour determined, she pulled Mary away from the barbarous ruckus.
Come away, Mary, before you meet with harm.
Wrenching and struggling, Mary jerked out of Anne's grasp. She threw herself between her father and her lover.
But, Papa!
Mr. King's voice roiled with thunder.
Get her out of here!
Anne forcefully ushered Mary out of the room. A burly servant racing to the scene nearly tumbled them over. Mary's heartbeat hammered against her chest. Pounding flesh, menacing groans, breaking glass, and falling objects echoed throughout the halls.
How has an evening with the man I love come to this?
Once inside Mary's room, Anne settled her charge by the fire and commenced pacing.
How could you have allowed yourself to be so easily persuaded to surrender your virtue to that man? How can you even ask such a question? You know how I cherish him. What is more, he admires me. We are to be married. Did he offer you his hand?
Mary bit her lower lip. She relished the spiced taste of him still lingering.
Not in so many words. What did he say?
He reminded me of his desires, his hopes, his plans, and how our dreams are one and the same. Anne threw her hands up in the air.
Do you know nothing of the opposite sex? He would have said anything at that moment to satisfy his desires.
Not Mr. Wickham. You simply do not know him.
I know his kind all too well. You are most fortunate in having a father who cares enough about you to protect you from the likes of Mr. Wickham.
Nervous and full of fear over her lover's fate, Mary stood and strode towards the window. She folded her arms about her shoulders. I do not consider myself as fortunate. I am rather embarrassed. What must Mr. Wickham think of me? How shall I face him again? Anne anchored her hands about her waist.
You should be embarrassed, as well as ashamed. As far as facing the gentleman, I believe if your father has his way, you shall never lay eyes upon him again, barring any unfortunate consequences.
Anne, there shall be no unintended consequences. Nothing happened. As for my not seeing him again, I believe you are wrong. No doubt after what has happened, Papa will insist the gentleman and I marry. That shall satisfy both of us.
I believe your father would see Mr. Wickham face down in a pool of the man's own blood rather than consent to an alliance between the two of you.
You are wrong. I am sure they are discussing the impending marriage as we speak.
You are determined to believe that some good will become of this. You must prepare yourself for the exact opposite. Your father was livid when he came upon you, and rightfully so. Nothing will remove the spectacle of what happened from his brain.
Mary headed towards the door.
Where are you going?
I must see Papa. I must allow him a chance to hear from me what has taken place. I must make him understand what he saw.
No, you had much better remain in your room until his ire has cooled than risk reanimating his wrath.
Miss Heston tiptoed towards the door.
Things have quieted considerably. I shall go downstairs to speak with your father. I pray he spared your Mr. Wickham's life, that he sent that vile man on his way, and we never see him again.
Mary drew a sharp breath. I know you never truly cared for him, but I always supposed you were on my side. Anne embraced her charge.
I am on your side. Your father is on your side. Mr. Wickham is not worthy of you, Mary. The sooner you accept it, the better.
As Anne opened the door, Mary threw a defiant look at her companion. I shall never accept it. Mary was glad for the solitude Anne's departure afforded, for it allowed her to dwell upon those things that mattered most to her. I must see him, but how? She crumpled her brow and bit her lower lip. I shall send word to him. He cares for me. Surely he is as eager as I am to clear up this misunderstanding. Mary proceeded to her writing desk. Halfway through the first sentence, she paused. After what happened in the library, who amongst the servants will see that he receives my missive? I must find another way. I have no one to rely on save myself. I shall set out on my own. She furrowed her brow and threaded her fingers through her hair. How might I possibly leave undetected? Anticipating the obstacles and strategizing the means of overcoming them, Mary arose from her seat and commenced pacing. I shall fashion a rope from my bedclothes, attach it to the bedpost, and climb down. Then I shall make my way to the stable and avail myself of one of Papa's horses. How difficult can it be to carry out my scheme? She dashed to the window, pushed it open, and poked her head outside. The chilly night air, combined with the prospect of finding herself entangled in the thorny bushes below, was akin to a splash of cold water on her face. Oh, what on earth am I thinking? As much as I wish to see Mr. Wickham,
Fleeing into the night is not the answer. I dare not compound this evening's chaos."
She closed the window, headed towards her bed, and threw herself on it.
Temperance is what is called for, not recklessness. I am on the verge of marrying the man who satisfies my every desire. Surely Papa will understand. I rely upon his support. More than that, I value his good opinion.
She passed what seemed like hours, sitting in the window seat and gazing at the bright full moon. Never had she seen her father in such a violent rage.
However did my dear Wickham fare against Papa's assault? Is he wounded? I shall never forgive myself should that be the case.
It had all been her own doing. Her wanton behaviour would never be excused, just as the disappointment in her father's face would never be erased from her memory. That she had been the means of such unhappiness and disappointment pained her.
What a wretched situation this is!
A light rap on the door summoned Mary to her feet. She wiped a tear from her eye and hurried to open the door.
"Anne?" "Mary, you must go to your father. He wants you in the library."
She was gone directly. Her father was walking about the room, looking grave and anxious.
"Mary, my child, what has happened to you? Are you out of your senses to allow that foul man to compromise you in this fashion? What is to become of you, the prospects for your future, should there be any unintended consequences pursuant to your recklessness?"
"You must not worry, Papa, for nothing happened."
"If you mean to say he did not ruin you in the eyes of your future husband, then I must thank God for that. But something certainly did happen. If what took place just hours ago in this very room were known to society, then you would be ruined in the eyes of the world in general. One can only pray that scoundrel has the decency to keep his mouth shut. It is only for the sake of your reputation I did not kill him."
Her heartbeat fluttered.
"Mr. Wickham would never utter a word of what occurred between us. He is an officer as well as a gentleman. What is more, it is a private matter between two people who are committed to each other."
"I must allow the fact that you believe the gentleman holds you in esteem as an excuse for your foolishness. However, I will not abide you standing here and defending him, not when I know the truth. Sit, my child. You shall hear the truth as well."
Mary took a seat. She cast a cursory glance about the room, waiting for her father's retort. All evidence of the earlier chaos was erased.
"That reprobate may be an officer, but he is no gentleman. Do you suppose a true gentleman would have called upon you under the cover of darkness at a time when he knew you were not chaperoned? Would a true gentleman have proceeded to seduce you, thinking no one would be present to stop him?"
"Papa, why are you ascribing such nefarious motives to Mr. Wickham? I confess he may have known you were out for the evening, but he had no knowledge that Anne was out as well."
"You are mistaken. He and Miss Heston exchanged greetings in Meryton no more than an hour before we came upon the two of you. His interest in your whereabouts drew her suspicion, and she immediately sought me out so we might return home. It is a good thing, too. I do not need to say what would have happened had we arrived a moment later."
He lowered his head.
"Never in your life have you ever given me cause for shame, until this evening."
"Papa, you may be ashamed of me, but I cannot share in your sentiments. I have nothing of which to be ashamed. Mr. Wickham and I are to be married."
He drew a quick breath and clenched his teeth.
"Married? Do not be ridiculous. Do you suppose for one instant that I would have agreed to such an alliance with an impoverished foot soldier with no motive other than securing your recently inherited fortune?"
"I fear you misunderstand him. He and I have talked about this at length. The two of us have come so far in reaching such a mutual understanding in so short an amount of time. He and I are so similar. We want the same things in life. What do I care that my fortune would be the means of accomplishing our shared dreams?"
His face contorted with annoyance.
"I will not suffer another word of your nonsense. You are too good for the likes of that scoundrel. I will not argue. I have decided you shall never see him again."
Mary crossed her arms in defiance.
"How shall you accomplish such a feat? Papa, I am nearly 21. Pray you do not intend to lock me in my bedroom until the militia decamps."
"I intend to send you to Liverpool to live with your uncle and aunt."
The thought of being separated from everything she held dear struck her with force.
"No! Papa, how shall I bear it in Liverpool, away from my home, my friends, from you? We have never been separated."
"Can you not see that this is the only way? Fate intervened this evening. I will not chance anything like this ever happening again."
After a pause, he placed his hand on her shoulder.
"I will do anything in my power to protect you from scandal. Anything, even if it means sending you away to live with your Liverpool relatives."
True to her father's words, mere days later found Mary sitting in a carriage across from Miss Heston and passing through the streets of Meryton. Along with so many of Mary's personal belongings, she carried the memory of Mr. Wickham. His bruising lips against hers, his manhood teetering on the brink of her innocence, stirring her still.
"Surely Mr. Wickham's ardent attentions to me of late have given rise to an expectation of marriage. What will everyone think of my precipitous departure?"
Now and again, Mary occasioned a glance out the window at the people on the busy street. In spite of her firm belief that her companion would not understand, Mary made no pretense of what she was about, for she had no control of her heart's beckoning.
"If I could see him one last time, I would carry the moment in my heart with me for as long as I live."
The sight of a redcoat struck a chord of anticipation in her chest. She leaned forward and peered out the window. There he stood, looking as if he were a man with not a care in the world, proud and tall and handsome as ever, with a Bennet daughter draped on either of his arms. There was no possibility that he might have seen her in the carriage. The two younger girls were all that caught his eyes. Twinges of jealousy stirred her amidst pangs of discord.
Did he dare utter a word of what happened between us to anyone? Did he have a good laugh over his conquest, boasting of achieving greater success than was his due?
She covered her face with both hands and blew out a frustrated breath.
"Surely you now see that your father's actions are for the best."
Mary huffed.
"Oh, Papa was opposed to any sort of alliance with Mr. Wickham from the start. We never stood a chance in the wake of his stern disapprobation." "Your father is not without his reasons."
"What have you to accuse the gentleman of now, Anne?"
"Your father has taken me in his confidence in that regard. He has it on good authority that Mr. Wickham is a gamester. He has incurred significant debts amongst the local merchants and tradesmen. Is there any wonder your father would be wary of the gentleman who only took notice of you once it was made known that you were to receive a generous inheritance?"
"You know I never cared about that."
"You must start caring about such things. You are an heiress. You have your whole life to look forward to. Once you are no longer in mourning, there is the prospect of a season in town. Your uncle is a wealthy gentleman with connections and a house in town. Even though he is adamant that you should marry your cousin, he will not deny you a season. I am certain of it."
Mary would not let go of her melancholy, despite her companion's words. Anne persevered.
"One day you will reflect on this moment, and you will be ever so grateful for a father who loves you and cares for you, and would do anything to protect you, including sending you to live far away from the only home you have ever known."
"That might be true,
But for now I would rather think of a life I might have had with a handsome man I might have easily loved in spite of his faults. Are we not all human, thus subject to human frailties?"
Mary surrendered to her tears. Anne moved to sit next to Mary. She embraced the younger woman.
"You reached for happiness. There is no fault in that. Alas, sometimes when we search for love, we do not always look in the best places."
Mary suspected her companion spoke from experience when she spoke of searching for love in the wrong places. She raised her head and studied her companion's face for evidence of the sentiments to which Anne oftentimes alluded, but never truly confided. The wistful look in Anne's eyes and traces of regret in her voice insisted she knew that of which she spoke all too painfully. Anne smoothed Mary's hair.
"You must rid yourself of the grief and despair where the lieutenant is concerned. You are an heiress on the dawn of an entirely new manner of living. I believe there will be the prospect of much gaiety in your future."
Nothing Anne could say assuaged the tumult in Mary's mind.
"Perhaps the things Anne pontificates are true, but how can I possibly think of any of that when my heart still aches for what might have been?"
Waves of despair flooded her entire being. The image of the young Bennet daughters clinging to his arms would not be repressed. Recalling all the pleasures of his touch just prior to the havoc of being discovered by her father, Mary wept.
"How I wish it were me on his arm."
Chapter 5. Till this moment. In the ensuing months, Mary and Anne had formed a silent truce as regarded Mr. Wickham. Time and distance had not taught Mary's heart to forget the man who would forevermore be considered her first love, but the forming of new acquaintances had been enough that her heart no longer ached over the thought of him. Any consideration she gave to their whirlwind courtship she kept to herself. Sitting across from Anne in the parlour, Mary studied her companion intently.
"You take an eager interest in your letter, Anne. By the turn of your countenance, it is from your sister. What news from Meryton?" "Mary, I am afraid the news is grave. Grave indeed. Please, come and sit next to me and listen to what my sister wrote."
Mary did not like the sound of her friend's pronouncement, but she did as she was told. Anne's sister had been diligent in keeping them abreast of the goings-on in Meryton over the past months. Normally, the news was good. Word of a wedding, a birth, and the like, even an account of the militia's decampment to Brighton. Mary had thought the development would have persuaded her father to allow her to return to her home. It did not, for his heart was now set on her being in Liverpool when her cousin returned from the continent in late autumn.
"Your father would not want you to learn the nature of the matter I intend to convey, but you need to hear this. First, prepare yourself for something dreadful. At last, Mrs. Bennet's dream of one of her daughters being married is realized, but its means of coming about had threatened to ruin the family entirely."
Catching her breath, Mary shifted in her seat.
What could be so bad? How might a marriage threaten the prospects of a family with 5 daughters?
Her unasked questions soon received an answer.
"Miss Lydia ran off with Mr. Wickham."
Mary's mouth gaped.
"Lydia? Mr. Wickham? No!" "I am aware she travelled to Brighton with her particular friend, Mrs. Foster."
The subject of how Mr. Bennet had agreed to such a scheme had been fodder for many a lively debate amongst the Meryton folks.
"Surely he could not have anticipated anything as grave as this." "I am afraid it gets worse. She left the protection of the Fosters and threw herself in Mr. Wickham's power, thinking they were to elope to Gretna Green. But they never did. Mr. Wickham never intended to marry the foolish girl at all."
Mary failed to control her heart's racing.
"But you said there was a wedding." "Indeed, but only after Mr. Bennet and Colonel Forster set off from Longbourn pursuant to the unhappy news, and headed to London to ascertain Miss Lydia's whereabouts. Mr. Bennet gave up the search and returned to Longbourn. In due course her uncle was the one who discovered them, living together as would a man and his wife. It is rumoured the conditions in which they were cohabiting were deplorable. My sister said Mr. Wickham was forced to marry Miss Lydia to salvage her honour. The marriage a patched-up affair, and at considerable expense to her uncle in town."
By now, Mary was pacing the floor.
"How could this have happened? What manner of man would tempt a young girl to leave the protection of her family and friends, believing she was in love and to be married?"
Mary swallowed the bitter taste of irony. Although fully aware Anne was speaking, Mary heard not a word she said.
"What manner of man indeed? He is no more than a predator, preying upon the young, the innocent, the unsuspecting. Poor Lydia is nearly half the vile man's age."
Her father had warned her on more than one occasion that the gentleman was not to be trusted. Her father had refused to allow her to be taken advantage of, as had been the case with the youngest Bennet daughter. He had protected her from a fate that might have been no different from poor Lydia's, the result being she would have been in the unenviable position of the woman who now called herself Mrs. George Wickham. Torn between relief and remorse, tears welled in her eyes. The life that might have been hers passed before her. The unhappy wife of a gamester, a schemer, a mercenary, and a scoundrel. Now perfectly understanding of how her life might have been, she settled herself in the window seat. She dabbed at her eyes. Mary did not intend to be unhappy. Was hers not a future filled with wonder and the promise of an upcoming season in town? Why, even the prospect of making her cousin's acquaintance was beginning to spark her imagination. Still, Mary could not contemplate all she had heard without considering how ridiculous she had been, courting passion beyond reason, and deriding the advice and wisdom of her companion and her own father, both of whom had known the heart-rending pain of misguided love. Sharp spasms of guilt rippled through her.
"How many times have I secretly wished my own father had been more like Mr. Bennet? Having come within an inch of walking in young Lydia's shoes, I cannot help but appreciate that which I derided as cruel and unfeeling mere months ago."
This knowing propelled Mary to her feet.
"Anne, would you mind terribly if I forego our walk and return to my room? I have a matter to attend which I have neglected for far too long."
She hurried up the stairs and settled at her writing table. Putting pen to parchment, she began her letter.
"Dearest Papa, how can I thank you for being such an excellent father? Please do not be annoyed with Anne, for she apprised me of the youngest Bennet daughter's harrowing ordeal. I know it all, the failed elopement, the fornication, her family's brush with ruin. I hardly know how to think or how to feel. Empathy, indifference. I can only ascribe with unwavering conviction to the sentiment, 'There, but for the grace of God, go I.' Your ever-loving daughter, Mary."
Mary sealed the missive to her dear father and set it aside. Another missive came to mind, the one she had received the week earlier from her cousin John. She opened the desk drawer and retrieved it. That he had written to her had originally met with her fierce objection. The impropriety aside, it undoubtedly was his way of conveying a familiarity she had not taught herself to reciprocate. With the letter in hand, Mary walked to the window overlooking the garden. She commenced reading John's letter again, only this time with the consideration it warranted. He wrote of many things, how he missed his family and how he longed to see his beloved home. The passage that now sprang from the page
and tugged tenderly at Mary's heartstrings was his ardent avowal of wanting to know everything about her joys, her displeasures, and above all else, her fondest wishes for her future happiness. Clutching the missive to her bosom, Mary gazed out the window and contemplated all the magnificence that stretched before her. The same beautiful flowers, the same pristine paths, and the same marble statues. Yet she suffered sentiments akin to seeing it all for the first time. She smiled. The dawn of a new life awaits me, and what a wonderful life it will be.
This has been Almost Persuaded, Miss Mary King, written by P.O. Dixon, narrated by Pearl Hewitt. Copyright 2014 by P.O. Dixon. Production copyright 2014 by P.O. Dixon.